February 19, 1943. Rabaul Air Base, New Britain. The intelligence report lay on the wooden table like a death sentence nobody recognized. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai picked it up with his left hand. His right eye was gone, taken by an American gunner over Guadalcanal 6 months earlier, and read the specifications again. Maximum speed, 375 miles per hour. Empty weight, 9,238 pounds. Engine, Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 2,000 horsepower. He laughed. It wasn't a polite laugh, the kind you offer when a superior officer makes a weak joke. It was genuine, from the belly, the kind that makes your ribs ache. Around him, other pilots, men who had turned the skies over China, Pearl Harbor, and the Philippines into graveyards for Allied aircraft, joined in. The sound echoed off the corrugated metal roof of the operations building, mixing with the humid afternoon air and the distant rumble of Mitsubishi engines warming up on the flight line. 9,000 pounds, Sakai said, passing the report to Lieutenant Hiroyoshi Nishizawa. The Americans have built a flying pig. Nishizawa, who would later be called the Devil by Allied pilots, scanned the document with eyes that had tracked and destroyed more than 80 enemy aircraft. His finger stopped at another number. Wingspan 42 feet 10 inches. He whistled low. The Zero is 1,800 pounds lighter. We'll fly circles around this thing. Outside through the open door, a line of Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters sat gleaming in the tropical sun. They looked like what they were, instruments of precision, extensions of the warrior's will, manifestations of the Bushido spirit in aluminum and steel. Each one weighed 5,244 pounds empty. Each one could turn inside any fighter the Americans had thrown at them. Each one represented a philosophy of aerial combat that had dominated the Pacific for nearly 2 years. Speed, maneuverability, the pilot's skill transcending the limitations of the machine. The Zero was not just an aircraft, it was a statement about the nature of war itself. Sakai had believed in that statement with religious fervor since his first combat mission over China in 1939. He had internalized it through thousands of hours of training that began before dawn and ended after dark. Training so rigorous that weak pilots washed out or died before they ever saw combat. In the Japanese Naval Air Service, you didn't just fly the aircraft, you became one with it, your nervous system extending through the control cables, your eyes merged with the gun sight, your spirit flowing into the engine itself. The American report described something different, something heavier, slower, less maneuverable, something that violated every principle Sakai understood about air combat. He tossed the report back onto the table. "Let them build their heavy fighters," he said. "When they come, we'll show them what real pilots can do." The other men nodded. Some returned to their quarters, where they wrote letters home on rice paper, carefully forming characters that spoke of duty and honor and the certainty of victory. Others walked to the flight line, where ground crews, boys really, 16 and 17 years old, swarmed over the Zeros with the devotion of acolytes tending to sacred objects. None of them understood what they had just read. The document wasn't describing a fighter. It was describing a weapon system. It was describing the future. And the future didn't care about the samurai spirit. To understand what was coming, you had to understand what had come before. In 1937, when the Imperial Japanese Navy issued its specifications for a new carrier-based fighter, the requirements seemed impossible. Range, 1,900 miles. Maximum speed, 310 miles per hour. Rate of climb, 10,000 feet in 3.5 minutes. And above all, maneuverability that would allow Japanese pilots, the most extensively trained in the world, to dominate any opponent in a turning fight. Chief designer Jiro Horikoshi and his team at Mitsubishi achieved the impossible by making everything light. The airframe was aluminum, thin as paper in places. There was no armor plating protecting the pilot. The fuel tanks were unprotected, saving weight but turning each aircraft into a potential fireball. The 7.7 millimeter machine guns were adequate but not powerful. Every ounce that didn't contribute to speed or maneuverability was eliminated. The result was a masterpiece. When the A6M entered service in 1940, it could outclimb, outrun, and most importantly, outturn anything in the sky. In the opening months of the Pacific War, Zero pilots achieved kill ratios that seem fictional. 12-1 over the Philippines, 10-1 over Burma, 13-1 in the Dutch East Indies. American pilots who encountered the Zero and survived brought back reports that sounded like they were describing a supernatural phenomenon. "They can turn on a dime," one Marine aviator said. "You think you have a shot, and suddenly they're behind you." The Zero's dominance created a mythology. Japanese pilots began to believe they were unbeatable, not just skilled, but spiritually superior. The aircraft became a symbol of Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, proof that Bushido and modern warfare were compatible, that individual excellence could triumph over industrial might. But while the Japanese were perfecting the art of the dogfight, the Americans were studying a different problem. At the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, Long Island, a team of engineers led by Leroy Grumman was asking a question that would change the war. What if we don't try to outturn the Zero? They had the combat reports. They knew the Zero's strengths, but they also knew its weaknesses, and one weakness stood out. The Zero couldn't take damage. The thin skin, the unprotected fuel tanks, the lack of armor, all the things that made it nimble also made it fragile. The American approach was different from its philosophical core. Where the Japanese sought perfection through reduction, the Americans sought superiority through addition. Where the Japanese asked, "How light can we make it?" the Americans asked, "How much can we add and still make it work?" The answer was the F-6F Hellcat. It was heavy, those 9,238 pounds that had made Sakai laugh. But that weight wasn't waste. It was armor plating, quarter-inch steel plates behind the pilot's seat and head. It was self-sealing fuel tanks lined with rubber that could absorb bullet strikes without exploding. It was 650 caliber Browning machine guns, each one capable of firing 750 rounds per minute, each round carrying enough kinetic energy to tear through aluminum like tissue paper. The weight was also speed. The 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine could push the Hellcat to 375 miles per hour in level flight. Not as fast as the Zero's 332 miles per hour maximum, but close enough. And in a dive where the Hellcat's weight became an advantage, it could reach 440 miles per hour, far faster than the Zero could safely achieve. Most importantly, the Hellcat was designed around a tactical doctrine that eliminated the Zero's advantages. American pilots were trained not to dogfight. They were trained to use boom and zoom tactics. Dive from above, fire a burst, and climb away before the Zero could turn to engage. If a Zero got on your tail, you didn't try to turn with it. You used your superior speed to extend away, then used your superior climb rate to get above it again. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't about individual skill or the warrior spirit. It was about systems, tactics, and industrial capacity. It was about turning aerial combat from an art into a science. But in February 1943, sitting in that operations building at Rabaul, Sakai couldn't see any of this. He saw only the numbers that confirmed his existing beliefs: heavy, slow, unwieldy. He didn't understand that those numbers represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare. From the individual to the industrial, from the artisan to the engineer. The Americans weren't trying to build a better sword. They were building a gun. September 1st, 1943, Marcus Island, Central Pacific. The Hellcat entered combat quietly without fanfare, at the tail end of a carrier raid against Japanese positions. The pilots of Fighting Squadron 5 flying from the U.S. at Yorktown encountered a mixed group of Zeros and torpedo bombers. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. Final score, Hellcats, 21 kills, 1 probable. Losses, 1 Hellcat damaged, pilot recovered. The American pilots returned to their carrier with adrenaline still singing in their veins and gun camera footage that would change everything. The film showed something the intelligence reports couldn't capture: Hellcats diving through formations of Zeros, firing and climbing away before the Japanese pilots could react. It showed Zeros trying to turn with the heavier American fighters and failing to get angles for shots. It showed 50 caliber rounds walking through Zero fuselages, sparks and smoke, and pieces of aluminum tumbling through the sky. One pilot, Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, wrote in his after-action report, "The F-6F is a forgiving airplane. You can make mistakes and it brings you home. The Zero is an unforgiving airplane. They make one mistake and they burn." The combat reports filtered through naval intelligence, through fleet headquarters, eventually reaching the command bunkers where the war's grand strategy was planned. Analysts studied the gun camera footage frame by frame. They calculated kill ratios, ammunition expenditure, damage sustained. They cross-referenced with previous engagements involving Wildcats, the Hellcat's predecessor, and found something remarkable. The Hellcat's kill ratio wasn't just better, it was an order of magnitude better. But the analysts were in Pearl Harbor and Washington. The war was fought in the sky over thousands of miles of ocean, in cockpits where theories met reality, where doctrine confronted chaos, where young men discovered whether they would live or die. October 26, 1943. Solomon Islands. Petty Officer First Class. Kazuo Tsunoda climbed into his Zero at Rabaul for what would be his 63rd combat mission. He was 24 years old. He had joined the Navy at 18, spent 4 years in training before he ever flew in combat, and had survived the meat grinder of the Solomons campaign through a combination of skill, caution, and luck that he knew couldn't last forever. He'd seen the intelligence reports about the new American fighter. He'd heard the rumors from pilots who had encountered it and survived. There weren't many. But Tsunoda was a realist in a military culture that discouraged realism. He understood that Japan was losing. He understood that every day more American ships, more American aircraft, more American everything poured into the Pacific while Japanese resources dwindled. But understanding didn't change what he had to do. The mission was simple. Escort a bomber strike against American positions on Bougainville. 24 Zeros, 18 bombers. The formation climbed to 18,000 feet and headed southeast. The ocean below was empty, beautiful, utterly indifferent to the men flying above it. They were 40 miles from the target when the Americans hit them. Tsunoda saw them first, dark specks diving out of the sun, coming fast. He shouted a warning into his radio, rolled his Zero right, and pulled back on the stick. The aircraft responded instantly, nose coming up, the world spinning around him in the familiar dance of aerial combat. But this time the dance was different. The American fighter, it had to be the new Hellcat, didn't try to turn with him. It dove through his altitude, fired a burst that went wide, and kept going down. Tsunoda tried to follow, pushing his stick forward, but the Zero's light airframe created too much drag. The Hellcat pulled away, diving faster than physics should allow. Tsunoda leveled out, scanning for threats. Around him, the neat bomber formation had disintegrated into chaos. Zeros were turning, climbing, diving, each pilot fighting his own battle. And through it all, like sharks through a school of fish, the Hellcats moved with terrible efficiency. He watched a Zero, he couldn't tell whose, attempt to engage a Hellcat in a turning fight. The Japanese pilot had the advantage initially, getting inside the American's turn, lining up for a shot. But the Hellcat pilot didn't try to turn tighter. He simply pushed his throttle forward and extended away, using his superior speed to open the range. The Zero followed, but couldn't close the gap. Then the Hellcat was climbing, and the Zero was burning. Tsunoda understood in that moment what the intelligence reports hadn't been able to communicate. The Americans had changed the rules. They weren't trying to outfight the Zero. They were making the fight itself irrelevant. He turned for home. 13 of the 24 Zeros made it back to Rabaul, 6 of the bombers. The target on Bougainville hadn't been touched. That night, in the crude barracks that served as pilot quarters, Tsunoda wrote in his diary, "Today I met the future. It is heavier than steel and faster than thought. I do not think we can stop it." By January 1944, Saburo Sakai could no longer laugh at the intelligence reports. He was stationed at Iwo Jima now, flying combat air patrol over the island's 2 airfields. The wound over Guadalcanal had never properly healed. He'd flown the 350-mile return flight to Rabaul with his skull fractured, his right eye destroyed, bleeding into his cockpit, and now he flew with persistent double vision, chronic pain, and the knowledge that his reflexes, his judgment, his edge were all degraded. But Japan needed pilots, and Sakai was still alive, which made him valuable. The intelligence briefings now included regular updates about the Hellcat. The numbers kept growing. 150 Hellcats in theater, then 300, then 500. The kill ratios kept climbing. 5 to 1, 8 to 1, 12 to 1. Some squadrons were achieving 15 to 1. Sakai read the reports with the careful attention of a man studying his own death certificate. In February, he encountered a formation of Hellcats during a bomber intercept mission. He was leading 4 Zeros against an American strike package escorted by 8 fighters. The Americans saw them coming from 20 miles out. They had radar now, another technological advantage the Japanese couldn't match, and positioned themselves perfectly. The engagement lasted 6 minutes. Sakai survived by breaking away immediately, using clouds for cover and running for home. The 3 other Zero pilots didn't return. The American bombers reached their target and destroyed 2 parked aircraft and a fuel dump. That night, Sakai sat in his quarters and did something he'd never done before. He questioned the philosophy that had sustained him through 5 years of war. The Zero was beautiful. It was responsive, nimble, a perfect expression of the pilot's will. Flying it was like meditation, a state of pure concentration where thought and action became one. In a turning fight against any other aircraft, a skilled Zero pilot was nearly invincible. But the Hellcat pilots didn't engage in turning fights. They had been trained to avoid the Zero's strengths and exploit its weaknesses. They stayed fast, stayed high, used their superior power and armor to survive mistakes that would kill a Zero pilot. They fought as a team, covering each other, refusing to be drawn into individual duels. Most devastatingly, they had numbers. For every Hellcat shot down, and some were shot down, the Zero pilots weren't completely helpless. 3 more appeared. The Americans were producing Hellcats at a rate of 2,500 per year. Japan's entire aircraft production, all types combined, was barely exceeding that number. Sakai had believed in the superiority of the individual warrior. He had trained for it, lived it, nearly died for it. But he was beginning to understand that individual excellence, no matter how refined, couldn't overcome systemic advantage. The Americans had built a system, aircraft design, tactical doctrine, industrial production, logistical support, that made individual skill less relevant. It was crushing, not physically, but spiritually. It meant that everything he'd believed about warfare, about the nature of combat, about the relationship between the warrior and his tools, was obsolete. He wrote a letter to his former instructor, Captain Minoru Suzuki, stationed now at Yokosuka Naval Air Base in Japan. The Americans have shown us that war is not about honor or skill or the warrior's spirit. War is about resources and systems and the capacity to replace losses. They are not better pilots than we are, but they have built a better war machine. I do not know how we can defeat a machine with spirit alone. The letter took 6 weeks to reach Japan. By the time it arrived, the war had already moved to its next phase. June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands. At 0700 hours, radar operators aboard the USS Lexington detected the largest Japanese air formation since Pearl Harbor. 373 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, approaching from the west. The American response was immediate and overwhelming. 450 Hellcats launched from 15 carriers. What followed would be called the Battle of the Philippine Sea by historians and the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by the pilots who fought in it. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, flying from the Lexington, was vectored toward the incoming raid by fighter controllers who could see the battle developing on their radar screens. He climbed to 23,000 feet with his division, 4 Hellcats flying in a loose combat formation, and waited. The Japanese formation appeared below them, a massive gaggle of aircraft, flying in loose groups, without the tight discipline that had characterized Japanese raids earlier in the war. Vrasiu could see why. These weren't the veteran pilots he'd faced in 1943. These were replacements, hastily trained boys who'd been rushed through abbreviated training programs because Japan had lost so many experienced aviators. The Americans had lost veteran pilots too, but they'd been replaced by men who'd gone through rigorous training in the United States, men who'd spent months learning to fly the Hellcat, learning the doctrine, practicing the tactics. More importantly, they'd been replaced by enough men. The American training pipeline was producing more pilots than the combat commands needed. Japan's training programs, hamstrung by fuel shortages and lack of aircraft, couldn't keep pace with their losses. Vrashu rolled his Hellcat inverted and dove. The Pratt & Whitney engine howled, pushing him past 400 miles per hour. His gun sight centered on a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber, called Judy by American intelligence, and he pressed the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns fired in a synchronized roar, 5,400 rounds per minute, each round tracing a phosphorescent arc across the sky. The Judy came apart. One moment it was an aircraft. The next it was burning fragments, tumbling toward the ocean 9,000 feet below. Vrashu pulled up, cleared his tail, looked for the next target. A Zero crossed his nose and he fired another burst. More hits, smoke trailing, the Zero rolling inverted and falling away. Another bomber, another burst, another kill. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. When it was over, Vrashu had shot down 6 Japanese aircraft. Around him, across 50 miles of sky, similar scenes played out. Hellcats diving, firing, climbing, diving again. Japanese aircraft fell in droves. Not because American pilots were better trained, though some were, and not because American aircraft were faster, though they were, but because the system worked. The Hellcats had radar guidance bringing them to the right position. They had superior radios allowing them to coordinate. They had self-sealing fuel tanks allowing them to absorb damage. They had armor plating allowing pilots to survive mistakes. They had overwhelming numbers. For every Japanese aircraft in the raid, there were more than 2 Hellcats in the air. By late afternoon, the battle was over. Japanese losses, 300 aircraft destroyed, including many that ran out of fuel trying to return to their carriers and ditched in the ocean. American losses, 31 aircraft, many from operational accidents rather than combat. The kill ratio was 19-1. On the receiving end of that ratio, in a Zero struggling to return to the carrier, Junyo with a damaged engine and fuel gauge reading near empty, was a young pilot named Kiyoshi Ogawa. He was 21 years old. He'd graduated from flight training 3 months earlier, received 40 hours of advanced combat training. Veteran pilots in 1941 had received 700 hours and been rushed to the fleet because there was no one else. His first combat mission had lasted 17 minutes before he'd seen his flight leader's aircraft explode in a ball of fire. His second mission had lasted 12 minutes before he'd made his first emergency landing with a damaged aircraft. This, his third mission, would be his last. The engine coughed, coughed again. The fuel gauge needle rested on empty. Below him, the Pacific Ocean stretched to the horizon, beautiful and lethal. His carrier was somewhere ahead. Assuming it hadn't been sunk, he'd seen American dive bombers heading toward the Japanese fleet, but he had no way to know how far. The engine quit. For a moment, there was only the whistle of wind through the canopy braces. Then training took over. Emergency procedures, checking altitude, 500 feet, not enough to glide far, checking for ships below, nothing, accepting what was coming. He had time for one thought before he hit the water. I never had a chance. He was right. The system had ensured it. The Hellcat wasn't just an aircraft. It was a component in an integrated weapon system that included radar, radios, carriers, logistics, training, industrial production, and tactical doctrine. Individual Japanese pilots, no matter how brave or skilled, were fighting that entire system with nothing but their aircraft and their courage. Courage wasn't enough. Saburo Sakai learned about the Marianas turkey shoot 3 days after it happened, reading a heavily redacted intelligence summary at Iwo Jima. The numbers had been sanitized, heavy losses instead of 300 aircraft destroyed, but he could read between the lines. He'd been flying combat missions for 5 years. He knew what heavy losses meant. That night, he walked to the edge of the airfield, where the runway lights were arranged to guide aircraft returning from missions. The lights were dark now. They only turned on when aircraft were inbound, to avoid attracting American attention. But their positions were marked by small white stones. He stood there for a long time, looking east toward the darkness where American carriers prowled, thinking about the path that had led from his laughter in February 1943 to this moment in June 1944. The transformation wasn't just military, It was philosophical. He'd believed in the primacy of the individual, in the power of skill and spirit to overcome material disadvantage. The war had taught him that belief was a luxury of the victor, a story the strong tell themselves to justify their strength. The Americans had shown him a different truth, that wars are won by systems, by industrial capacity, by the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. It was a bitter lesson. It meant that all his training, all his skill, all the Bushido philosophy that had sustained him through years of combat was obsolete. Not wrong, exactly, but irrelevant in a conflict where one side could produce aircraft and pilots faster than the other side could destroy them. He thought about the young pilots arriving at Iwo Jima, boys who barely knew how to fly, being rushed into combat with inadequate training. He thought about the Zeros on the flight line, each one maintained by ground crews working with salvaged parts because new parts weren't arriving. He thought about the fuel shortages that limited training flights, the ammunition shortages that meant pilots went into combat with partially loaded guns, the food shortages that meant everyone was hungry all the time. And he thought about the American carriers, each one capable of launching 100 aircraft, each aircraft flown by a pilot who'd had comprehensive training, each pilot supported by radar and radio, and an industrial base that could replace any losses. The gap was unbridgeable. Japan could train better pilots, design better tactics, fight with more determination. None of it mattered. The Americans had built a machine that couldn't be stopped by individual excellence. He'd laughed at the Hellcat specifications in February 1943. Standing on the edge of Iwo Jima's runway in June 1944, he finally understood what those specifications meant. They represented a different philosophy of war, one that prioritized systems over individuals, reliability over elegance, industrial strength over warrior spirit. The Zero was the better aircraft for a dogfight. The Hellcat was the better weapon for a war. The months after the Marianas Turkey shoot were a slow-motion collapse. In August 1944, Sakai was transferred to Yokosuka Naval Air Base in Japan to serve as an instructor. The transfer was presented as an honor, sharing his expertise with the next generation, but he understood it for what it was, an acknowledgement that he was no longer fit for frontline combat. The head injury, the persistent vision problems, the accumulation of stress and trauma had degraded his abilities to the point where he was more valuable training others than dying in combat. The students he trained were children, 16, 17, 18 years old, pulled from schools and farms and factories, given rudimentary instruction in how to fly an aircraft, and sent to die. The training program had been compressed from years to months, then from months to weeks. By late 1944, pilots were going to their units with 60 hours of flight time. Some had never fired their guns at a target before arriving at their combat squadron. Sakai tried to teach them what he knew: energy management, deflection shooting, situational awareness, the thousand subtle skills that separated living pilots from dead ones. But there wasn't time. They needed warm bodies in cockpits, and they needed them now. He watched them climb into their aircraft, taxi to the runway, take off toward the south. Some came back, most didn't. In November, Sakai was ordered to brief a group of new pilots on American aircraft and tactics. He stood in front of 30 young men, their faces still soft with youth, and tried to find words that would prepare them for what was coming without destroying their morale. The American fighter you're most likely to encounter is the F-6F Hellcat, he began. It is heavier than the Zero, less maneuverable in a turning fight, but faster in straight-line speed and much more durable. American pilots are trained not to engage in dogfights. They will use boom and zoom tactics, diving from above, firing and extending away before you can respond. A young pilot, he looked about 16, raised his hand. Sensei, if we're better at dogfighting, how do we force them to dogfight with us? Sakai looked at the boy's eager face and felt something break inside him. How did you tell someone that the question itself was based on a false premise? That the Americans had designed their entire tactical system to ensure they never had to dogfight? That individual skill, no matter how refined, couldn't overcome systemic advantage? You don't, he said finally. If you encounter Hellcats, you stay with your wingman, maintain your energy, and look for opportunities to disengage. Your goal is to survive the mission and return to base. The pilots looked at each other, confused. This wasn't what they'd been taught. They'd been told about the warrior spirit, about the power of determination, about how Japanese pilots were superior to Americans. Now their instructor, a legendary ace with 64 confirmed kills, was telling them their goal was to survive? I know this contradicts what you've been told, Sakai continued, but I'm trying to keep you alive long enough to become effective pilots. The Americans have industrial capacity we cannot match. They have radar, they have radios, they have numbers. Our advantage is experience and skill, but you need to survive long enough to develop those advantages. He didn't tell them that by late 1944, the experience advantage was mostly gone, that the American pilots rotating into combat squadrons had undergone training as rigorous as anything Japan had offered in the war's early days, that the Hellcat squadrons now included veterans with dozens of kills, men who knew the aircraft intimately and flew with cool professionalism. He didn't tell them that Japan was losing, that the war was effectively over, that they were being sacrificed to buy time for a homeland defense that couldn't possibly succeed. He told them to survive. August 16th, 1945. One day after Japan's surrender. Saburo Sakai sat in a cell at Atsugi Naval Air Base, waiting to be processed as a prisoner of war. The cell wasn't really a cell, more a converted office with a guard posted outside. But after 5.5 years of war, any confinement felt claustrophobic. He'd survived. Against all odds, against all probability, he'd made it through the entire war. The skull fracture over Guadalcanal that should have killed him. The infections that should have killed him. The dozens of combat missions where he should have died. The slow starvation of the war's final months when food became so scarce that even pilots went hungry. The American firebombing campaign that had turned Japanese cities into ash. He'd survived all of it. Now he waited to learn what the Americans would do with survivors. The guard outside was Japanese. The Americans hadn't yet taken control of the base, but he wore a white armband indicating surrender. Through the window, Sakai could see the flight line. The aircraft had been lined up in neat rows, disarmed, their propellers and weapons removed. Zeros mostly, but also some newer models he barely recognized. They looked like museum pieces already, artifacts of a lost war. On August 17th, American trucks arrived at the base. Military police, doctors, administrative personnel. They moved with casual efficiency, the confidence of victors who didn't need to prove anything. Sakai and other Japanese officers were loaded into trucks and driven to Yokohama, where a makeshift POW processing center had been established in an old warehouse. He expected brutality. The Japanese military had committed atrocities throughout Asia, and Sakai had seen enough of war to know that victors rarely showed mercy. He'd heard stories, some probably exaggerated, some probably not, about what Americans did to Japanese prisoners. What happened instead was bureaucracy. He was photographed, fingerprinted, given a medical examination by an American Navy doctor who spoke broken Japanese. The doctor noticed the scar tissue around his right eye socket, asked questions about the injury, made notes on a clipboard. "You need surgery," the doctor said. "The bone fragments here," he gestured at Sakai's temple. "They're pressing on the optical nerve. It's causing your vision problems." Sakai stared at him. "You want to operate on me?" "Well, I don't personally. I'm not a neurosurgeon. But we have specialists who can fix this. It'll take a few hours, but the procedure is routine now. We did a lot of these for our own pilots." "I'm a prisoner of war," Sakai said, as if the doctor might have forgotten. "You're also a human being with a treatable medical condition," the doctor replied. "We're not barbarians." 2 days later, Sakai was transported to a U.S. Navy hospital ship anchored in Tokyo Bay. The ship was vast, gleaming white with a huge red cross painted on the side. Inside, it was clean, modern, impossibly well supplied. American medical personnel moved through corridors lined with equipment that Japanese hospitals couldn't dream of possessing. He was prepped for surgery by nurses who smiled at him, who treated him with professional courtesy, who didn't seem to care that he'd spent 5 years trying to kill their countrymen. The anesthesiologist, a lieutenant commander named Richardson, explained the procedure in careful English that Sakai mostly understood. "We're going to put you to sleep," Richardson said. When you wake up, the worst will be over. You'll have pain for a few days, but then you'll feel much better. Sakai wanted to ask why. Why were they doing this? He was the enemy. He'd shot down American pilots, probably killed some of the men who were now treating him. By any logic, they should let him suffer, let the injury kill him slowly, or at minimum make him wait behind the American wounded. But Richardson was already placing the mask over his face, telling him to count backward from 10, and Sakai was thinking about the Hellcat specifications he'd laughed at in February 1943, thinking about how the numbers had meant something different from what he'd understood, thinking about systems and philosophies and the price of misunderstanding. He made it to 7 before the darkness took him. When he woke, the pain was extraordinary. His head felt like it was splitting open, and for a moment he thought the surgery had failed, that they'd killed him accidentally or deliberately. Then a nurse was there, an American woman with red hair and gentle hands, adjusting his medications, speaking soft words he couldn't understand. The pain receded to something manageable. Over the following days, as he recovered in a ward with other former Japanese military personnel, Sakai had time to think about what had happened. The Americans had operated on him immediately, without making him wait, using resources and expertise that could have gone to their own wounded. They treated him not as a conquered enemy, but as a patient requiring care. It was crushing in a different way than losing the war had been. It meant that even his understanding of his enemies had been propaganda. He'd been told Americans were soft, decadent, lacking in martial spirit. He'd believed it, even as the evidence mounted against it. But here in defeat, he was experiencing something worse than cruelty. He was experiencing competence, organization, in a system that valued human life efficiently rather than dismissing it dramatically. The Americans hadn't won because they were more determined or braver. They'd won because they'd built a better system, and part of that system was sophisticated enough to recognize that treating prisoners well was strategically and morally correct. One afternoon, about a week after the surgery, Sakai received a visitor. An American naval officer, a commander wearing aviator wings, entered the ward and approached his bed. The man was in his 30s, tall with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in cockpits. "Lieutenant Commander Sakai?" the officer said in accented but understandable Japanese. Sakai nodded, trying to sit up. The commander gestured for him to stay down. "I'm Commander James Sweat. I flew Corsairs off the Bunker Hill. I wanted to meet you." "Why?" Sakai asked. Sweat pulled up a chair. "I read your service record. 64 confirmed kills, 5.5 years of continuous combat. You survived getting shot through the head and flew 350 miles back to base. That's remarkable." "I lost," Sakai said simply. "You lost the war," Sweat corrected. "You didn't lose every fight. There's a difference." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to tell you something. A lot of American pilots have a huge amount of respect for Japanese aviators. Early in the war, you guys handed us our asses. The Zero was terrifying. Your tactics were superior. Your training was superior. You made us rethink everything." Sakai looked at this man, this enemy who tried to kill him, whom he tried to kill, and saw something unexpected. Professional respect. Not pity, not condescension, but the acknowledgement of one warrior to another. "Then why did we lose?" Sakai asked. It wasn't really a question. It was the question that had haunted him for 2 years. Sweat was quiet for a moment. Because war isn't just about individual skill. It's about logistics, production, training pipelines, technological innovation. You guys built the best aircraft for 1941. We built the best system for 1944. He leaned forward. The Hellcat wasn't a better aircraft than the Zero in a lot of ways, but it was a better component in a larger machine. And that machine, the carriers, the radar, the radios, the industrial base back home, that's what won. "The Hellcat," Sakai said, surprising himself by smiling. "In February 1943, we laughed at the intelligence report about it. 9,000 pounds. We thought it was a joke." "I know," Sweat said. "We heard about that. Some of our intelligence guys thought it was funny. Japanese pilots dismissing the Hellcat because it was heavy. But you were right in a way. It was heavy. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the product of some master craftsman refining every detail to perfection. It was the product of engineers solving a problem. How do we build something that lets average pilots defeat excellent pilots? And you solved it, Sakai said. We solved it, Sweat agreed. But that doesn't make what you did any less impressive. You fought with everything you had, with equipment that became obsolete, with resources that dwindled, with a strategic situation that was hopeless. And you survived. That takes something the Hellcat specifications don't measure. After Sweat left, Sakai lay in his hospital bed and thought about that conversation. The American had given him something unexpected: context, a way to understand his experience that didn't require him to dismiss his own skill or deny the magnitude of Japan's defeat. The Zero had been a masterpiece. The Hellcat had been a solution to a problem. Both were true. Neither negated the other. Years later, after he'd returned to civilian life, after Japan had rebuilt itself from the ashes, after the war had faded into history and memory, Saburo Sakai received a letter from an American aviation historian named Henry Sakida. The letter included a statistical breakdown of the Pacific Air War compiled from Japanese and American records. Total F-6R Hellcat production, 12,275 aircraft. Total A-6M-0 production, 10,449 aircraft. Hellcat combat record. Total kills, 5,163 confirmed, plus approximately 2,000 probables. Total losses, 270 in air-to-air combat, plus 780 to ground fire and operational accidents. Kill ratio, 19:1 overall, higher in some specific engagements. Zero combat record, your total kills, estimated 1,500 to 2,000, confirmed, records incomplete. Total losses, estimated 7,000 to 8,000 aircraft, records incomplete. Kill ratio, varied from 12.1 in early war to 1.1 or worse by war's end. The numbers told a story that individual experiences couldn't capture. The Hellcat hadn't just been a good aircraft, it had been a phenomenally successful weapon system. It had achieved its design goals so completely that its victory seemed, in retrospect, inevitable. But Sakai knew that inevitability was an illusion created by hindsight. Nothing had been inevitable in February 1943 when he'd laughed at those specifications. The Hellcat's success required thousands of variables to align: industrial capacity, tactical doctrine, training systems, logistical support, strategic planning, and the courage of individual pilots who flew it into combat. The Zero's failure, and it was a failure, no matter how he tried to reframe it, hadn't been about the aircraft's design. The Zero was still, objectively, a remarkable piece of engineering. Its failure had been strategic. Japan had built an aircraft for the war it expected, rather than the war it got. They'd optimized for individual combat when the war would be decided by industrial attrition. They'd built a sword for a gunfight. Sakai wrote back to Sakida, thanking him for the statistics and adding his own perspective. The numbers you've provided are accurate but incomplete. They measure outcomes, not experiences. They can tell you how many Hellcats were produced, but not what it felt like to see one diving out of the sun, knowing your aircraft couldn't match its speed or absorb its firepower. They can tell you the kill ratios, but not what it meant to watch young pilots, boys really, climb into obsolete aircraft and fly towards certain death because there was nothing else. I have spent 40 years thinking about why we lost, and I believe the answer is simpler than most analyses suggest. The Americans understood that modern war is industrial before it is martial. They built systems that allowed average pilots to defeat excellent ones, that allowed their industrial base to replace losses faster than we could inflict them, that prioritized effectiveness over elegance. The Zero was designed by craftsmen who believed in perfection. The Hellcat was designed by engineers who believed in solving problems. In 1941, perfection was enough. By 1944, only solutions mattered. This is not to diminish what American pilots accomplished. They were brave, skilled, and professional. But their bravery was amplified by their equipment in ways that ours was not. A brave man in a Hellcat could make mistakes and survive. A brave man in a Zero could not. When I laughed at the Hellcat specifications in February 1943, I was laughing at numbers I didn't understand. I saw weight and thought slow. I should have seen armor and thought survivable. I saw power and thought brute force. I should have seen capability and thought flexibility. My failure wasn't one of intelligence, but of imagination. I couldn't imagine a different philosophy of aerial combat because the Zero's philosophy had worked so well for so long. That failure of imagination cost thousands of lives. Not because the Zero was badly designed, it wasn't, but because we insisted on fighting the war we wanted rather than the war we faced. June 19th, 1969, 25 years after the Marianas turkey shoot. The ballroom of the San Diego Hotel del Coronado was filled with men in their 50s and 60s, wearing suits and ties displaying name tags that read USS Lexington Reunion or VF-16 Squadron Association. They were former Hellcat pilots gathered to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Among them, at the invitation of the reunion organizers, was Saburo Sakai. He'd been reluctant to accept. What did a former enemy pilot have to contribute to American veterans celebrating their victory? But Commander James Sweat, now retired Admiral Sweat, had been insistent. "You're part of the story," Sweat had written. "The men who were there want to meet you." So Sakai had flown to San Diego, paid for by the reunion committee, and now stood in a ballroom full of men who'd spent years trying to kill people exactly like him. The conversation stopped when he entered. 60 American naval aviators turned to look at the Japanese pilot in their midst. Sakai felt his throat tighten, his old combat instincts screaming at him that he was surrounded by enemies. Then Admiral Sweat was there, hand extended, breaking the tension. "Gentlemen, this is Saburo Sakai. He flew Zeros in the Pacific. He's an ace with 64 confirmed kills, and I'm honored he could join us." The handshakes started. One by one, American pilots approached Sakai, introducing themselves, sharing stories. Lieutenant Alexander Vratsiu, who'd shot down 6 aircraft in a single mission during the turkey shoot, talked with him about deflection shooting. Commander Edward O'Hare's wingman described the tactics that VF-16 had used. A former Hellcat pilot named Robert Duncan, who'd been shot down by a Zero in 1944 and spent a year as a POW, gripped Sakai's hand and said, "I hated you guys for a long time, but then I realized you were just doing your job, same as us." The formal program included speeches, presentations, the showing of gun camera footage. When the footage from the Marianas turkey shoot began, grainy black and white images of Hellcats diving, firing, Japanese aircraft falling in flames, Sakai watched with complicated emotions. These were his people dying, his countrymen, young men he might have trained or flown with. But he couldn't look away. During the dinner, Sakai was asked to speak. He hadn't prepared anything. He hadn't expected to be asked. But he stood and found words. 25 years ago, you defeated us completely, not just militarily, but philosophically. We believed that individual excellence, warrior spirit, perfection of craft could overcome material advantage. You proved us wrong. But I want you to know, we did not fight without honor. The young men who died in the turkey shoot, the pilots who flew obsolete aircraft against overwhelming odds, they were brave. They were skilled. They deserved better equipment, better training, better leadership. They deserved to survive. The Hellcat gave you that chance to survive. The Zero did not give us that chance. That was not your fault or our fault. It was a decision made by admirals and engineers and politicians, people far from the cockpits where the actual fighting happened. Today, I am honored to be here among warriors. You won because you built a better system. But we all fought in the same sky. We all felt the same fear. We all saw our friends die. That creates a bond that transcends victory and defeat. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for showing me that former enemies can become friends. And thank you for building a peace that has lasted longer than the war. The applause was genuine. Men who'd fought against the Zero stood and clapped for the man who'd flown it. Afterward, groups formed, conversations continued, and Sakai found himself at a table with 5 former Hellcat pilots, discussing tactics and aircraft performance. and the strange experience of surviving when so many hadn't. One of the pilots, a man named Thomas Clark, who'd flown off the Enterprise, asked the question Sakai had been expecting all evening. "When did you know you were going to lose?" Sakai thought about it. "October 1943, he said finally. "The first time I saw a formation of Hellcats. Not because they were better aircraft, I didn't believe that then, but because of how they fought. They didn't try to dogfight. They'd clearly been trained to exploit the Zero's weaknesses and avoid its strengths. That level of tactical sophistication, that willingness to fight in a way that wasn't honorable or traditional, that told me you understood the nature of modern war better than we did." "We didn't think of it as dishonorable," Clark said. "We thought of it as smart." "Exactly," Sakai said, and that difference in perspective was decisive. The evening ended late. Men exchanged addresses, promised to write, took photographs together. Sakai posed for a picture standing between Admiral Sweat and Alexander Vrasiu, three aces from opposite sides of the war, all of them old now, all of them survivors. Before he left, Vrasiu pulled him aside. "I shot down 19 aircraft in my career," he said quietly. 19 pilots, maybe dead, maybe captured. I don't know their names. I never wanted to know. But I want you to know something. I respected every one of them. They were doing their job. I was doing mine. The fact that I survived and they didn't was luck as much as skill." "The Hellcat was more than luck," Sakai said. "Yeah," Vrasiu agreed. "It was. But even in a Hellcat, things could go wrong fast. I had close calls, we all did. The difference was the Hellcat gave you more chances to make mistakes. The Zero didn't. That's not about pilot quality. That's about design philosophy." Sakai nodded. After 25 years, he'd finally met Americans who understood what he'd been trying to articulate, that the war had been decided by systems, not individuals, and that recognizing that truth didn't diminish the courage of the men who'd fought in it. Saburo Sakai lived until 2001, dying at the age of 84. He spent his post-war years as a printer, a businessman, and eventually as a public speaker and author, writing about his experiences and advocating for peace between former enemies. He returned to the United States multiple times, meeting with American veterans, speaking at military gatherings, serving as a bridge between two cultures that had once tried to destroy each other. The F-6F Hellcat was retired from U.S. Navy service in 1954, though some remained in use with other nations until the 1960s. A few dozen survive in museums and private collections, testament to an aircraft that changed the nature of aerial warfare. The Mitsubishi Zero flew its last combat mission in August 1945, though a handful of airworthy examples still fly at air shows, carefully maintained by dedicated enthusiasts. But the real legacy of both aircraft isn't measured in museums or air shows. It's measured in the transformation they represented. The Zero embodied a philosophy of warfare that emphasized individual excellence, spiritual strength, and the perfection of craft. It was a philosophy that had dominated human conflict for millennia, the belief that superior warriors could overcome material disadvantage through skill and determination. The Hellcat embodied a different philosophy: warfare as an industrial process, victory through systems rather than individuals, the optimization of every component to create a whole that exceeded the sum of its parts. The Pacific Air War was, in many ways, a contest between these philosophies, and the industrial philosophy won decisively. This victory had consequences that extended far beyond World War II. The modern military is built on the Hellcat's principles: integrated systems, technological superiority, logistical excellence, the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. Individual skill still matters, but it's amplified or constrained by the systems within which it operates. When Sakai laughed at the Hellcat specifications in February 1943, he was laughing at the future. He didn't know it then. He couldn't see how those numbers, 9,238 pounds, 2,000 horsepower, 650 caliber machine guns, represented a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought. But by the time he stood in that San Diego ballroom in 1969, surrounded by men who'd flown those heavy, powerful, inelegant machines into combat, he understood. The Hellcat hadn't been designed to be beautiful. It had been designed to win. And in the end, and the only measure that mattered, it had succeeded completely. The last word belongs to Sakai himself from an interview conducted in 1998. People ask me which was better, the Zero or the Hellcat. It's the wrong question. The Zero was the better fighter aircraft in terms of pure performance in a dogfight. It was lighter, more maneuverable, more responsive. Flying a Zero was like flying with wings attached to your body. You thought about turning and the aircraft turned. But the Hellcat was the better weapon system. It was part of a comprehensive approach to aerial warfare that included radar, radios, carriers, logistics, training, and tactics. The Hellcat pilot had advantages that had nothing to do with the aircraft itself. He had better intelligence about where the enemy was. He had better communication with his wingmen. He had better training in the specific aircraft he flew. He had armor that allowed him to survive mistakes. He had an industrial base that could replace his aircraft if it was damaged. Most importantly, he had a military culture that valued his life. The Hellcat was designed to bring pilots home. The Zero was designed to be the best possible instrument for killing the enemy, even if that meant the pilot had less protection. Those different priorities reflected different philosophies about the value of human life and the nature of warfare. I flew the Zero for 5 years. I loved it. It was a beautiful aircraft, and flying it well was an art form. But if I had to fight the Pacific War again, knowing what I know now, I would choose to fly the Hellcat. Not because it was more maneuverable or faster, it wasn't, but because it would give me the best chance to survive, to fight another day, to eventually go home. The Americans understood something we didn't, that in modern war the goal is not to die gloriously for your country, but to make the enemy die for his. The Hellcat was designed around that philosophy. The Zero was not. That difference, more than any technical specification, more than any tactical innovation, is why we lost. The story of the F-6F Hellcat in the Mitsubishi Zero is at its core a story about change, about how the nature of warfare transformed during World War II from individual combat to industrial warfare, about how technological and organizational innovation can overcome traditional martial virtues, about how the courage and skill of individual warriors becomes less decisive when one side has systematic advantages in production, logistics, and doctrine. It's also a story about reconciliation. Saburo Sakai's post-war friendship with American veterans, his willingness to acknowledge his former enemy's strengths, his advocacy for peace. These represent the possibility of moving beyond conflict, of recognizing the humanity of those we once fought against. The numbers in this story are real. The kill ratios, the production figures, the dates, all drawn from historical records. The personal stories, while dramatized, are based on actual accounts from Japanese and American pilots who fought in the Pacific. But the deeper truth is about something numbers can't measure. The experience of men who flew into combat, knowing they might not return, doing their duty as they understood it. Whether they flew Zeros or Hellcats, whether they survived or died, they were warriors caught in a conflict larger than themselves, shaped by decisions made in design bureaus and military headquarters, far from the cockpits where they fought. In the end, the Hellcat ruled the Pacific not because American pilots were braver or more skilled than their Japanese counterparts, but because America built a system that made victory possible and survival likely. That system, industrial, logistical, technological, tactical, was the true innovation of the Pacific Air War. The Zero pilots who laughed at the Hellcat in February 1943 weren't fools. They were warriors judging a weapon by the standards they knew. They couldn't imagine that those standards were about to become obsolete. History belongs to those who adapt fastest to changing circumstances. In the skies over the Pacific, that adaptation happened with brutal speed. The laughter of February 1943 became the silence of June 1944, and in that silence, the nature of aerial warfare was forever changed.